on the cultures of innovation. And I'm sure we've all heard the buzzwords, diversity and innovation, or inclusion, pardon me. And today we're going to ask the question, what do they really mean? And when I say that, I'm asking from a practical or a in practice in your day-to-day life or in your day-to-day work activities. We're going to try to answer that question for the audience today. And I'm part of this really terrific group that you can all see in front of you here. And we really hope to offer, we've actually hand selected this group so that we can offer a really wide range in perspectives. But really the point I think of today is to hopefully have this develop into a more organic conversation. And we really want to hit on kind of your topics of interest as the audience. So before I do go ahead and introduce the panelists, I wanted to just take a moment to let the audience know that as a group, we're really excited to hear your questions. So please add them to the Q&A feature, I think in front of you, and we will basically try to answer those questions over the course of the next hour as we proceed. And if we don't get to all the questions in that hour, the other thing we wanted to let you know is that you can always reach out to us. We're all on LinkedIn, and I think most of us, if not all of us, have also provided our email addresses in our speaker profiles. So you can reach out to us that way as well. So I'm going to start by introducing myself, and then I'll move on to introducing the other panelists. So my name is Caralyn Bennett, and I'm a geological engineer by training. I have more than 35 years in the energy sector, mostly in the traditional energy sector of oil and gas. I am currently the Chief Strategy Officer for GLJ, a global energy consulting firm, and we do hire regularly from the University of Calgary. In fact, pretty sure we have a job posting open right now if you're interested. So at GLJ, I lead our diversification efforts, and that includes both geographical diversification beyond the borders of Canada, as well as functionally in the new areas of emerging energy and sustainable development best practice. And I'm also the president of the Canadian Heavy Oil Association and one of the co-chairs of the Canadian Society for Unconventional Resources. And you'll notice that we have networking fair rooms later today if you'd like to join us there. But both of these two organizations, I wanted to just take a moment and say that we're working really hard to ensure that Canada, I was going to say claims, but really I think it's reclaims our place as the global leader in innovation and responsible energy development. So that's one of the goals of those two organizations, both really. So now I think I'd like to introduce the panelists, and not in any particular order, but I am going to start with Annie Korver. So Annie is a purpose-driven entrepreneur dedicated to enriching relationships between Indigenous and corporate communities. Inspired by reconciliation in Canada and her own Métis ancestry, Annie founded her company, Rise Consulting, in 2013 to advance reconciliation and Indigenous inclusion with a focus on economic development. Bringing together Indigenous and corporate communities to create shared value, Annie champions a values-based approach to strategic inclusion. She creates undisputed space for her clients to realize their vision and establish inclusive relationships, ultimately supporting our clients with reconciliation. Annie has provided leadership to support the success of various Indigenous inclusion, economic development, and regulatory activities for organizations such as Trans Mountain, Pembina Pipelines, and Imperial Oil. And she is told that the positive energy she brings with her work is welcomed. Annie's background in economic development, marketing, and communications provides her with a solid foundation for translating multifaceted socioeconomic challenges and opportunities while leveraging the strengths and skills of those around her. Annie holds a Master's of Business Administration and an Aboriginal Relations Leadership Certificate, both from the University of Calgary, a Bachelor of Tourism Management from Thompson Rivers University, and is a certified public participation practitioner, that's alliteration for you, through the International Association of Public Participation. Annie is a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta and is proud to serve as a member of the Board of Directors with the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business and is a member of the Circle for Aboriginal Relations Society. So thank you for being with us today, Annie. And next I'm going to move on to Kudjo Fiakpui. I think I got that right. Cujo is a regulatory specialist, sporadic thespian, and newbie app developer. Interesting background. With a background in chemical engineering, his professional career has seen him develop an acumen for regulatory design and delivery, international relations, and government engagement. He has advised Alberta Environment in relation to oil field injection policy, the Alberta Department of Energy regarding bitumen valuation measurement, Alberta Innovates with respect to thermal in situ water conservation, Environment Canada pertaining to sulfur emissions from oil sands projects, and the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program related to principled governance of shale resources. In his current role as senior advisor with the Alberta Energy Regulator, he leads work related to Government of Alberta actions to develop a robust, clean hydrogen economy. And Laura McInTyre, next on the list. Laura is a professional engineer with a passion for innovation, connecting individuals, driving successful projects, and most importantly, having fun. She has nearly 20 years of experience in oil and gas with a focus on thermal oil sands and heavy oil projects. During her time in industry, Laura has held a variety of technical and leadership roles at 2 Canadian oil sands companies. In her current position, she sits on the executive team of Acceleware as Vice President of Engineering. Acceleware is currently in the pilot stage of developing an enhanced oil recovery technology that will be both transformative and an environmental game changer. Laura volunteers for the DirectHer network as the corporate partnerships lead. She is excited to build relationships with the corporate community, providing access to education that will empower women to take their seat at the boardroom table. And certainly not least, but last nonetheless, Jen Turner, as the first woman to work on many of her assigned rigs and projects, Jen has over a decade of experience providing geological drilling supervision in Alberta. When she graduated and moved out west, she was the chair of the board for the Newfoundland and Labrador Sexual Assault Crisis and Prevention Center and a board member of Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, Newfoundland and Labrador. In 2017, Jen joined an organization called Iron and Earth as communications director, where she advocated for renewable energy and delivered a cross-cultural indigenous solar installation and training program in Alberta. Jennifer is now the Director of Communications for Project Reconciliation, a growing group of Indigenous communities that are working towards purchasing the Trans Mountain Pipeline and investing revenues to support energy transition, decarbonization, and renewable energy. She also sits on the board of the Canadian Heavy Oil Association and the Energy Advisory Council of ResourceWorks. While Jen has witnessed much change over the course of her career, she believes it's critical to drive further change and make room for early career professionals like yourselves to become leaders in the transformation of industry and the creation of a more sustainable and competitive future. So with that was quite the introduction. We are going to kick off the conversation. And we have an opening question that I'm going to pose, I think, to all of the panelists. So we'll each take a turn providing an answer in the hopes that, again, the audience will be, reaching out with some questions that we can follow up with. But to kick it all off, we thought we'd ask the question of all the panelists, what does inclusion mean to you? And what does it look like in your everyday life? So how does it show up every day when you're at work and in your day-to-day life at home? And maybe what we'll do is go to Jen, actually, for that first.
Hi, I think I'll just take a step back and do, I think, an acknowledgement. I'm actually joining you today from Victoria and beautiful Vancouver Island, and I'd like to just quickly acknowledge that I am a settler on the homeland of Coast Salish peoples, specifically Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples, and I want to thank them for allowing me to live, work, and play on their beautiful lands here. And as a settler, I do benefit from privilege that I believe I have a responsibility to help try to dismantle, and it's my privilege to join you here today. So moving into a discussion, I think, a timely discussion of inclusion. I thought a lot about this, and I think a lot of people would have different answers. I think inclusion comes down to listening and truly understanding that. And I thought a lot about this answer. And for me, I brought it down to a brave or a true open-heartedness. If we achieved that, then we would be ready to truly listen to each other and have an understanding of how we're doing better. We would listen less defensively. We would listen less out of self-interest, and then we would go ahead and act accordingly, you know, even if it's difficult. So, and if we did that, we would bridge those gaps and start to erode some of the otherness that really hurts all of us, and some people more than others. So I think that's what inclusion means to me. And I'm really happy to be here and joining you today and participating in this conversation.
We'll get used to it. Thank you very much, Jen, for kicking it off. And maybe Annie, will we go to you next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Caralyn. Thanks, Jen. And thanks for that land acknowledgement. That's really important. And I think for the rest of us on this call, we're located in Calgary, and we're grateful to live, work, and play in the traditional territory of the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley nations of the Stoney Nakoda, and for me, the home of the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 in Calgary. And for me, inclusion is a big part of what I've been doing, and really the work that I do through RISE. Inclusion and equality are very closely interconnected. I think to be equal, we must learn to trust and respect each other. And Jen just spoke to that. We need to be transparent and take the time to understand each other. Trust isn't something, and we know we're humans, we've all been in relationship. It's not something that just happens. It takes time. And acknowledging that it takes time, that then you'll start to form stable relationships. And it really becomes the bridge between the unknown and the known. And I think as we invest in that, and our presence and how we show up, what we do and what we say, these are all things that support our ability to build trust and respect, that help us to be inclusive, to help us to move towards equality and build that trust and respect. And I really think that that leads to our ability to understand each other, to become curious, to think with curiosity, to respond with curiosity. That really then that's what will help us to start to build meaningful relationships.
Thank you for that perspective, Annie, and thank you also for the land acknowledgement on behalf of the balance of the panel. Cujo, maybe we'll go to you next.
Sure. So, you know, when I have conversations about inclusion, I'd say they typically, for me, center around 4 words. So those words being empathy, respect, integrity, and outcomes. One of the words that often comes up when we have these conversations about diversity and inclusion is the word tolerance. And for me, inclusion goes beyond tolerance. It's not about tolerating people. For me, it involves being empathetic towards the experiences and challenges faced by those who are different from you. It involves respecting that people who are different from you have experiences and knowledge that is of value. It looks like, I'd say possessing and demonstrating integrity with respect to your efforts to engage. And honestly, I think one of the things that sometimes gets overlooked is that it looks like achieving outcomes. Outcomes related to your efforts to learn, outcomes related to actions associated with, seeking out and addressing acute and systemic forms of discrimination, and outcomes related to giving diverse voices, a meaningful seat at the table. To sort of highlight my point about sort of respecting the uniqueness of individuals and groups and cultures, about approaching conversations with, empathy and integrity. Oftentimes when those of us sort of both inside and outside of the energy space wish to have diversity and inclusion conversations, they are sort of often kept at an incredibly high level. So, also when I think about what inclusion looks like to me, and what it looks like in sort of everyday life, um, it goes around respecting sort of a duality around expedience. And, what I mean by that is that, yes, on one hand, we must have a mindset that says we need to expediently achieve meaningful outcomes related to sort of, equity and gender parity and combating racism. We must be of a frame of mind where we're not going to ask people who have run into walls and ceilings and discrimination to wait. While that sort of must be our mindset, we also need to be cautious about having expedient conversations on the topic of diversity and inclusion. Conversations where sort of a group of leaders can cast an incredibly wide net to engage either staff or an unspecific group of stakeholders, and say, let's have discussions about diversity and inclusion. While there are several problems with that approach, the primary one that I'd highlight is how it sort of inattentively tosses various marginalized groups into a single bucket. So, Black people, Indigenous people, Asian people, South Asian, transgender, gay, lesbian, sort of come one, come all, tell us about your concerns, and then we'll try to respond in a way that covers all of you. So yeah, just sort of wrapping up those thoughts. For me, it looks like, again, those 4 words: empathy and respect and integrity and outcomes. And then from those words, there's a sort of recognition around a mindset where we're seeking to expediently achieve meaningful objectives, but are cautious about having expedient, abstract conversations that are sort of inattentive of the unique issues faced by different groups.
Thank you, Cujo. And Laura, we will go to you next.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, my video cut out there, so I disappeared for a moment, but I'm back, and fingers crossed, no future issues, but great words to follow up from my cohorts. A lot of, meaningful comments there, the diverse voices that Cujo talked about. And I really like Jen's comment about listening. To me, that's what I've found throughout my career, is so often it's people competing their voices. You get in a meeting, I remember someone saying, be the first person to talk in a meeting, that will show a position of power, and or trying to be the person that asks the most questions. And I've kind of learned that's not necessarily being authentic, especially for me. That didn't feel comfortable, and I felt like I was pushing myself. And so I would just say authenticity is so important as you go through your career. When I think of inclusion, I know I'd say in the last 5 years, obviously diversity and inclusion has really come to the forefront, and it's been great to be able to see, in a previous company, actual training going on, corporate requirements, so many courses, webinars, social media, different options to be able to access and understand what diversity and inclusion means, but they often get lumped together. And until I started to better understand that, because diversity, as Kudjo talked about, having different genders, races at the table, I think people just see that as a checkbox, but inclusion is that next step. And I'd say that's the really difficult one. The forces for sameness are just natural human being. We want to be hanging out with friends that we deem to be like us. And so that's just a comfortable place that people often go to. So it's encouraging working groups, companies, friend groups to think about the diversity, but also including the voices at the table. I read a study that said being excluded will activate pain sensors in your brain. It is incredible to think about, it's not just this feeling of I didn't get a chance to have my input in that meeting. It actually, you'll be left with a permanent, mark, or just a feeling. It will increase your defensiveness, it'll affect your emotional well-being. So definitely something to be aware of. And as companies move forward in practicing more inclusive behaviors, I think it's really increasing overall performance. So critical. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you to everybody. And I'll maybe just add a little bit my own personal perspective. I think for me as an individual, I've always looked at inclusion as not just, being able to come to the table, but actually being invited to the table. And I think, with that, when I get there, I very much appreciated Laura's comment about authenticity. I really want to have that ability to be myself when I'm at the table. And for me, some of that is actually being recognized, I think, for the contributions I'm making. But I think, again, like these are going to be different things for each one of us. But I do think there's the common thread that, even if someone doesn't crave kind of a public recognition or a formal recognition, everybody does want to be recognized for their contribution in some fashion. They want to be valued. And I think for me, really as an individual, that's what inclusivity or inclusion looks like. And I know as a young engineer that entered the workforce in the 80s, I entered as a very quiet individual. And I think I went to meetings, and what I offered in meetings was very carefully curated. And I was conscious not to disrupt. I was maybe subconsciously curating what I was saying so that I would be accepted. And even though I did that, of course, I ran into challenges anyway. And there were specific instances early in my career, I think, where I was really sidelined for the most part. So specifically excluded from important conversations where I had made a significant contribution up to that point. And it did impact. And I think these things, again, to everybody's points, they have the ability to make a significant impact on people's decisions and on their careers. And for me, where it took me away from the producing company world, so away from the oil and gas producing companies into the consulting world. And there was a reason that I went there. And I went there because I wanted to be able to select the people and select the projects that I was going to work on, because I wanted to avoid, and I think this was all subconscious at the time, but I wanted to avoid those circumstances from having them happen again. So I think now, like many, many years later, in my role at GLJ, I think this has been a motivation for me. And it's also not just my experience, but I've certainly seen the experiences of, many others kind of in the energy industry, in industry in general, that have had these challenges and faced these challenges. And I really feel, I think, an obligation as a leader to actually make some change. I'm motivated to create an environment where GLJ, we're 100 people. I think it's an easier problem in some ways to solve with a smaller company. We're far less hierarchical than a lot of large organizations. We have also always had a lot of flexibility in how we can contribute in the office, like work from home, long before COVID ever came to pass. So there are a lot of good things. But even with a small company, we have challenges. And the example that I would like to give or offer is that next year we will be 50 years old as an organization. And I am the first female executive at the company and the first vice president of the company. And that was, some 40 years into the life of the company. And if I look at kind of our roster today, we've got, if I use gender as an example, we've got 50-50 parity, roughly speaking, in terms of gender parity. But as you look at the leadership of the company, you can see that we're falling short. So, we have a task in front of us. And I think it's been a really important step for our organization to actually acknowledge that problem. And it's only when you can acknowledge it, then does the company come together and we start to find ways to put resources towards it and find a path forward. And it does require time, it does require effort. And I think, ultimately, this hopefully all leads to that corporately for our people, to that feeling of belonging, where people can come to work and they can sit at the table and they can contribute in their own unique way with their own kind of unique strengths and talents. And I think that's how I generally see it. And I really also think we're kind of at the beginning of that journey, mostly here in the energy sector. We've got a long way to go yet. So anyway, more conversation on that. I think we do have a number of questions. So maybe let's take a look at some of those. Oh, it's a good question. How does diversity and inclusion play a role in the application process? So when someone's looking for a job in terms of interviews and applications. And I don't know if anybody has a perspective on that they'd like to share.
Yeah, for sure. I can share a bit of my experience in that space and working with clients. It's so how does it play a role? I would say that it does play a role. So versus it didn't and now it does, and it's this movement. And really what we're seeing is criteria being set as organizations put their hand up. And there's another question actually that Caralyn will probably read shortly that sort of speaks to this as well, as sort of through this movement, we've really seen this explosion. You know, social issues were thrust into the spotlight in 2020, and so diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, you know, this term, it's really being used. And so what we're seeing is organizations starting to sort of put their hand up and say, I'd like to actively participate in that. And so what does that mean? When Cujo sort of spoke a little bit about the metrics, is we're quick to go there, and regulators unfortunately are quick to take us there as industry or as organizations, where they say, tell me what you're going to do. And that, although that's where we go, it really starts for organizations that I work with values, and saying, what are the values of our organization? What is our purpose? And how do we build what will potentially be criteria in the hiring process? So the and you have to sort of unpack that process. So for an organization to say, you know, we're going to promote jobs, we're no longer just going to promote them on one channel, because potentially just one channel isn't an inclusive way to communicate. And so the criteria actually becomes linked to the process that they put in place, that then drives the metrics and helps to achieve whatever that looks like, as they've set sort of criteria to achieve a diverse team in the organization. So you'll and if you haven't already, the individual who asked the question, or folks who are listening, is you'll see that more frequently now as you apply for a job and you're asked to self-identify, you're asked for information, and it's voluntary, but really that's sort of a purposeful process. And so when metrics are being put in place, that part of it is companies say, we really want a diverse team. What could that look like? You know, Caralyn mentioned gender parity. Companies are saying we want 50-50 by 2025, and so this is the movement.
Well, I'll maybe jump in and add a little bit to that on the metrics piece, and because I do think, you know, we've all been thinking about diversity for a little bit longer than maybe we've been thinking about inclusion. So, you know, to Annie's point, you know, the regulator has put in place opportunities for companies to set targets and comply and explain to try to drive up numbers. But the question is, at the end of the day, if you set targets and if you meet those targets, does that mean you have an inclusive work environment? Does that mean you have an inclusive system? And it doesn't necessarily mean that. So we actually have to dig beyond. It's not just about the numbers. It's not just about the statistics. And that's one of the pieces too with the application process, right? So I think it's really about that authenticity piece, and really kind of, I know when we hire at GLJ, one of our goals is to really hire people that have the kind of the natural kind of talents and aptitudes and desires, the things that really energize them. We want to match them up with the job that they're going to be doing here, right? Because it's going to let them really thrive, and we're going to enjoy the benefits of that alongside them. So I think it becomes a win-win for both, you know, the person that's coming on board as well as for the company. I think we could maybe go on to this second question. Cujo, did you have anything you wanted to offer on that before we move on to the next one?
No, I think that you guys covered it really well.
So there's a question here, which I think Annie touched on a little bit about dismantling systemic barriers present in the very design and structure of our workplaces. And how do we go about doing that? And how do we go about getting more women, LGBTQ, oh, it moved on my screen, representatives to become board members to influence strategic direction at a high level? And I don't know if anybody wants to jump in and answer that one.
I can provide some comments, as Caralyn mentioned at the start. So I am part of a network. It's called DirectHer Network, and I encourage all of you to check it out. I can put the link on the commentary here, but it's a not-for-profit female-led organization. And when I met the president, Chantal, a couple of years ago, I said, whatever you're doing, I'm so curious. Her main drive or focus is to increase the female seat opportunity at the board. So offering low cost, accessible education, which I just love. And I would say, to that question, there's two sides of it. It's if you're interested in being on a board, regardless your gender, your race, it's educating yourself, understanding which board positions make sense for you, but also, as a user, a product user, a consumer, it's demanding of your companies and challenging them to have that diverse board. So it comes at both levels, and you have power in both sides of it. There is definitely legislation happening even within Canada to increase percentages of females on board. So it's slowly happening. And I do think, as we talked about with diversity and inclusion, people are starting to understand the data and the science behind it. And so I would say it's part of a larger movement, as Caralyn mentioned, but I would say as the individual, take it upon yourself to become educated, whether or not it's this low cost education or enroll in your ICD. There's plenty of opportunities at not-for-profits. They're always looking for board members. So I'd say step outside your comfort zone and apply for that board seat, and definitely look into any opportunities.
And don't we have a role? I think also like one of the older people kind of on the panel, I think we have, like us older generation, have an important role to play where we, shoulder some of the responsibility really. Because it's really hard, I think, for people coming from a diverse background or in a marginalized group to always be the ones that have to speak up for themselves. So it really is the responsibility of the leaders to take that on and to help people kind of see that pathway forward and build the bridges in it. And it does mean that we have to have, I think, very often some difficult conversations and learn to diffuse defensiveness and diffuse these things so that we can actually hear what each other have to say and come to that better path that we're looking for. But I think in terms of trying to get more women and other diverse groups on boards, there's a role for leaders to play. We can be mentoring, we can be identifying opportunities. Like people did this for me when I was younger, so I really do see it as one of my responsibilities in terms of giving back in support of the future of our industry.
I agree. I would just add one more to that. I do think, Caralyn, that's a great point. Mentorship. It's finding your advocates, your mentorships, your cohort, your partners that will support you. I'm noticing it more and more in my day-to-day. Just, Annie and I have had conversations this week. I need support with this in my role. It's powerful to bring in resources and develop those networks. So definitely encourage that piece of it.
Well, it makes me want to actually get Annie maybe to share a little bit on kind of the education piece that I think it's, somewhat of a, maybe from a different lens, but an extension of some of your comments, Laura and Annie. I know that this is a part of, what your company does in the world. You're out there helping build bridges. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that for the audience too, from an educational standpoint and the importance of it.
Sure. I mean, it's humbling to think about, where we all are right now in our journeys, in our lives. We're shaped by our experiences. And, I know Deanna Burgart, I see you, has been a great mentor to me. And we learn as we go along, and this piece with, specifically for me, in my passion for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, I'm a servant leader, and in that space I teach and I share, and that's what brings me great happiness in my role. And I acknowledge that takes time, just like, earlier when I talked about trust takes time. It won't happen overnight. And, our ability to be really give ourselves that grace to know that I'm going to just sit and listen, you know. Creator gave me 2 ears and just one mouth. So I think I'll listen and I'll learn and to do that. And, you know, for me, you know, learning more about Black History Month, or learning more this month with Black History, I mean, it's fantastic to be able to sort of be in this space and be in this place and welcome that knowledge. And so that's something that I do with Rise. And it's paramount. A commitment to lifelong learning is something that I really value, and I encourage as I sort of travel and make my way.
Thank you for that, Annie. Anybody else on that question, or should I read out the next one? It's a long one. So it says, everyone is struggling, but some more than others. The pandemic has amplified social and economic inequities found within communities of minorities. What do we as a panel see as meaningful steps to address this within the workplace?
I would
Shall I-
just like to acknowledge that I'm really happy that somebody asked this question. So for me, early in my career, for the longest time, I was the only woman on, you know, at the beginning on some really big projects. And I have seen a lot of change, but also I know that it's nowhere near enough. And one of the things that has happened with COVID is that anyone who is already more vulnerable, anyone who is already more likely to be marginalized, bears disproportionate weight from a very challenging event. And it kind of compounds. This is a really important conversation for us to have here, because we're in the energy industry, we work in oil and gas. So we were in a really challenging position. For a lot of people, quite understandably, a really fear-driven position, including a lot of decision makers are really driven by fear now. So I think just identifying how important it is for us to even have this conversation specifically in this industry, I think is really important. I looked up the data because I was so concerned about COVID. I feel like it is pushing out the very people that, you know, really need to be in and lifted up. So I looked back at what happened in 2008 when there was a really big crash. And across a lot of companies, the difference between how they were doing in 2007 and 2008, they really slid back in terms of, you know, the metrics that were being even measured back then. So I think it's very important that we not let fear make us become even in a weaker position. It's very important for us to go in the opposite direction. And I think normalizing that in conversation, identifying that risk and how important it is to avoid it is really important. So I think other people might want to add to that question, but I really just want to thank you for asking it. I'm not sure if there are any simple answers, but I think identifying the importance of taking action is very important.
I'd like to add a bit there as well. I think when you look at that question, representation, it matters. And I going back to Annie's point earlier, I know that that there's often a reflex to go to metrics, and there's some traps in there, but there is benefits to using metrics to sort of see how you're doing, in the sense that one of the things that happens when you have these conversations around inclusion and diversity is leaders will often go to groups to ask, what can we do? And what that ignores is that there is already a lot of information out there. How you're doing, there are statistics to tell you how you're doing from a representation perspective. And it won't tell you, yes, qualitative, how people feel in your organization, but it can give you an indication of how you're doing from a representation perspective. And what I think what you risk it by consistently going to groups and asking that question is, one, you take the burden sort of off of yourself to educate yourself, and you're consistently putting the burden on marginalized groups to tell you their stories when they're consistently doing it both professionally and personally. And I've talked to people that say it's emotionally draining consistently having to have these conversations. So I really like that question because, what do I see as meaningful steps? I mean, yes, metrics aren't the end all be all. And it's something that I think becomes a trap. Oftentimes organizations will point to some sort of policy or guideline to say, this is how we're addressing inclusion. When, those policies often don't address inclusion at all. They just address sort of really overt forms of discrimination. But they can help you assess how you're doing from a representation perspective.
Well, and maybe I just jump in and I would add to that. And this is the engineer in me, but it's the idea about if you measure it, at least you're then aware, right? So there's an awareness piece that comes, and at least then by measuring it, we tend to move forward. Still, it's not happening in real time anywhere fast enough, I think, for us to get to a place of equity or parity in real time in our lifetimes. So these are the reasons why we need to then go above and beyond. But I do think there is value in it as well, Cujo, for all of these reasons. And I think your point about the leadership of companies really taking more of this on to their shoulders is really, really important, because it's scary to bring this stuff forward. Like people just stay quiet, right? They stay quiet and they leave an organization. This is what happens. So to create a space where people can come forward, but better yet, for a leader to speak up before they have to and acknowledge it takes the pressure off. And I think, none of this stuff is easy though, right? It's uncomfortable for everybody. And I think growth is uncomfortable. So there is a little bit of a piece here too, where we all just have to get a bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable more often. And that's how we'll all get better and move forward. But I do very much agree with the concept of, the fact that companies are now setting targets and tracking these things. It's not going to solve the problem, but it is a step in the right direction, and it does help us move forward. I'd maybe give one or two examples of some of the things that we've been trying to do at GLJ. And one of the things that we've got going on, it's tied with, the whole transformation really of the energy sector and my role at the company. And because we're really needing to reinvent ourselves as an organization, one of the key pieces here is that we really need all hands on deck. We can't afford not to have everybody fully engaged in our mission, if you will. So we've tried some different things to maybe make our organization a little bit more inclusive. And one of the things was that we established some functional teams that kind of cut across our operational teams. And then what that did is it put different people together in different ways to approach problems in different ways. So that's been really effective for us. And another thing that we have done is we've set up these renewables teams. And we didn't designate, Cujo, you're on team hydrogen, and Caralyn, you're on team geothermal. We actually asked people, what team do you want to be on? And then people put up their hand, and we built the teams from that place, from a place of self-selection. And so there's some things that are really, I think, pretty easy. Now, again, we're a smaller company. I think it's a lot easier to do some of these things in a smaller company than it is to do in a very large hierarchical firm. But there are some simple things that we can all do, I think, within our organizations to make things more accessible, to make a workplace more inclusive of everybody, and get everybody to contribute in the way that they feel most comfortable.
There was a question that just came in, Caralyn, that I think you've just somewhat answered about what are some specific actions that certain energy companies have taken to support diversity and inclusion. And that was a great list. And in my experience, lots of time, I guess it's working across teams to understand, from sort of hiring perspectives, who are the roles that you need to hire for? What are you planning for? And then how do we create programs specific to, for me, as I'm working in community with Indigenous peoples, to sort of attract Indigenous peoples into these roles. So be it sort of training and mentorship program specific, time spent in community, sort of teach and learn. Offering flexible work environment is another big one. For me, as Rise grows, something that doesn't sit well with me is sort of the term vacation days or flex days, because really I'd like to just build an environment where it's clear what we're doing, where we're going, what our purpose is. And, if there's a POW day at Lake Louise, please go and shred the gnar and work at night. That's totally fine. So flexible work, partnerships are really big in my opinion. Working, Kudjo spoke to this, there's so many people working in this space. So aligning yourself, working with other organizations, both at Trans Mountain and at Imperial, we worked with Women Building Futures on sort of training to employment program for Indigenous women. Mentorship networks. Caralyn just mentioned networks. So those are just a few to rattle them off.
Can I jump in here?
Please.
Because Joel's asked a couple questions that I'd like to just take a second to touch on. So appreciate you submitting the questions. You asked 2 questions. Do you think that it's necessary to ask a person's race in applications? And then also asked, do you consider the identification of race in an application process to be a two-edged sword, and that a person might not want to identify or use a Western name for fear of rejection? So to your point, I think I think there's 2 sides to the coin here. I don't know that it's use a two-edged sword, but there's two sides to the coin here. As I spoke to before, because even if somebody says I'm not racist, there's a reality that unconscious bias exists within a lot of people. So until we're at a place where we feel that unconscious biases are being addressed, people are being educated on them, are conscious of traps, things like, oh, well, she seems like a pretty busy mom. So the comments that sometimes people fall into like that, I think it is important. I don't think it's a bad thing for companies to ask for race, because again, metrics can be indicators of how you are doing. However, similar to the point I brought up about how many organizations have these guides and policies that deal with overt forms of misconduct and discrimination, things like metrics are not what, again, that in of itself can be a trap to think you are being inclusive. So yet like the guidelines, they do absolutely nothing often to address the systemic issues, advance equity, seek out and address unconscious biases amongst leaders or recruitment personnel. So, the answer I'm going to give to that is sort of yes and yes, that with where we're at right now, I believe that not just in the energy sector, but in a lot of sectors and a lot of businesses, there is unconscious bias. When one of the things that gets talked about in a lot of places is how oftentimes getting into jobs, how you get good positions is through referrals, and how referrals promote a lot of homogeneity within a company. And so if that is the case, and you have a certain type of person that is in recruitment positions, is in leadership positions, and they're bringing in and promoting the people in their circles, then I don't feel that is an entirely bad thing to be asking about race in an application, and most of those that I've seen, they give you the choice to not answer the question if you don't. But I hope that one day we can get to the point that you don't have to ask that question.
Great answer. Thank you, Kudjo. So we do have like a, go ahead, Laura.
No, I think a concept that is percolating throughout this dialogue is psychological safety. And you know, especially in the energy industry, I've just recently met Jen, but hearing her past experience working, potentially I could picture her out on a well site or needing to learn more about Jen's history. But myself, I spent a lot of time out at the drilling rig or out at our plant. And it's a lot of the old school mentality of, you know, just kind of suck it up. And, you know, if you're hurt, don't say anything. And I saw through the years, EHS, environmental health and safety, become a thing. And I remember people saying, oh, this is just, I need to record these incidents, or they saw it as a bit of an issue or a problem, or just more of like a hassle in their day-to-day. But 5-10 years later, they look back and look, how many people's lives have we saved? How many injuries have we reduced? It's incredible to see the transition. And so now the term psychological safety is kind of newer, diversity inclusion. Obviously, I see the same transitioning happening there. It's feeling comfortable being able to speak up. I saw a question about a boss and bullying, and that's just not acceptable. And you know, it's being confident and comfortable and being able to speak to either it's HR, your peers, or just finding the right pathway, but definitely being able to voice any concerns, feeling safe at work is very important. So I think if anyone's having those challenges, definitely reach out to a trusted source. And, you know, like, again, it's kind of, I liked Kudjo's touch on empathy, it's getting to know people at a deeper level. It's not just, hey, how's it going? And you get the canned response, oh, I'm good. It's what are you troubled by today? Or just digging deeper into the mental health, I think, is something that is very important in the workspace.
And definitely an added challenge of COVID. Go ahead, Cujo.
I was just going to say, just building on what Laura mentioned, you know, one of the things that I heard about a few months ago that Shopify has done is, and you can sort of look this up in their sustainability reports, is set up these employee resource groups that are very specific. They sort of started with Slack to create virtual communities for women and parents and people of culture. And they eventually moved to these employee resources groups that represent employees that are, you know, Asian, Black, Indigenous, Latino, LGBTQ+, persons with disabilities. And they've been really positive for Shopify in that they provide these places that people can have safe discussions. And, you know, even though I really promote having power as an individual and embracing it, there is also power in a collective, and being able to voice concerns to your peers and bring those concerns forward as a collective. So just an example, and building on what Laura said, is an example of a company that's found a solution that works for them, and maybe something that folks that are part of this can look into.
Thank you, Cujo. It looks like we're down to just about 5 or 6 minutes left, and I haven't read through this series of questions. This last series of questions. Does anybody have anything to offer on them? Want to read out maybe one of those questions and share a response? So if I can jump in really quickly, like there was a question here about how allies can support underrepresented groups, and how do we address pushback and even hostility towards the efforts. And you know, so I'm drawing off my experience introducing significant change in organizations when I make this comment. But I do find when there is a hostile reaction and people get defensive, there are ways of diffusing those circumstances so that you can, you know, enter a conversation and acknowledge that, you know, this isn't about pointing fingers. This isn't about blaming anyone. This is about, you know, having really like a respectful conversation, and really just work with people, and acknowledge, I think on some level, some of the reason why we are where we are today. Like very often there are reasons why we kind of got to the spot that we are. So if we can start to acknowledge some of those reasons, but then speak to why we need to change and why we need to evolve, I think you can start to pull down a lot of that defensiveness that people will initially have, and it'll diffuse the situation, and then you can have a healthier conversation, then you can actually move forward. So that's what I would offer on that.
Great, thanks, Caralyn. Well, I think we're just we just have 2 minutes here, so I just wanted to close and say thank you, and maybe one final comment from me is just around the sort of the resource group that Kudjo mentioned, or the network that I mentioned. I think that a tenet that I use that my colleagues here have heard me say is, you know, I really appreciate nothing about you without you when I work with Indigenous peoples. And when you're working in an inclusive workplace where Indigenous employees feel welcomed and heard, in my experience, we step forward, and that sort of that exhaustion that Kudjo mentioned, it's not there because we're empowered to participate. And it's part of, you know, if you're working in sort of a 9-to-5 environment, it's happening within that environment, and you're actually being part of that movement. As the leadership says, this is an inclusive workplace, this is where we're going, and it's built within. So it's built on the tenant, nothing about you without you. And so thank you for having me.
Love that. Thank you very much, Annie. Jennifer?
I'd just like to say that I'm really happy to see this conversation become more normalized. I think the uncomfortable conversations are very important. And one of the things that Kudjo said earlier that really struck me is the observation that these conversations are happening more, but they're happening at a high level. And as we normalize this conversation, I think we have to be more aware of that gap and really consider who has the right to make the call and what is progress. It's not so much just the people that, it's really not, you know, the people that are already at a high level in general. So just, you know, who has the right to tell the stories of success. So that's, I think, part of lifting up the people that need to be lifted up to address some of these gaps, to close some of these, gaps, and I'll be stronger for it. It's not us versus them, like a lot of people in this industry, I think will think. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of that change, and I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me here.
Thanks for joining us, Jen. Kudjo?
Yeah, we're running out of time, so I'll just be very quick. You know, when I think about change, for me, it's purposeful and progressive actions that, you know, happen over a period of time. And you know, I'm already sort of hearing some folks in the energy sector say they're, you know, DNI'd out. So I just encourage leaders to just continue to be leaders and bang that drum. You know, a lot of the inciting action that happened with these conversations happened around when George Floyd was killed, and that was less than a year ago. So we're still early. Let's, you know, continue to move forward.
Thank you so much, Kudjo. Laura?
Well, I'm not sure if we're still online, but yeah, just
we have one more minute.
The challenge is what I would say. I look back and regret so many times not speaking up for how I was either treated or I saw coworkers treated, and don't accept it. That's my advice, and you'll end up in a better place for it.
And I maybe just want to add, if I have a second, you know, we need you. Like, we need this generation. Like, we need to make massive changes in the energy sector, and it's going to need new approaches. It needs you. So I think, you know, really time is of the essence. We're all trying to transform. So this is the perfect time to really to embrace diversity and inclusion and find better ways of, you know, I don't know, everybody just, you know, being able to participate to their fullest within our organizations, and at the same time really show up for the industry and for Canada. So please join our industry and help us.